Social cognitive theory. After studying this chapter, you will be able to describe examples of how personal characteristics, behavior patterns, and environmental factors interact to influence learners' behaviors, define and provide an example of self-regulation and self-efficacy, and describe how they contribute to achievement, explain what it means to be a self-regulated learner, and note how teachers can help students acquire this capability, summarize research findings on various aspects of social cognitive theory, note how technology can be used to promote self-regulated learning. In the last two chapters, we examined two very different descriptions of how learning occurs. Operant conditioning focuses exclusively on the role of observable external events on learning new behaviors and strengthening or weakening existing ones. According to this theory, people are exposed to stimuli, they make some sort of response, and the reinforcing or punishing consequences that do or do not follow influence the probability that those responses will be made again. Consequently, operant conditioning requires that people make observable responses for others to conclude that learning has occurred. The strength of operant conditioning is the insight it brings about how environmental consequences affect learning. Its main weakness is that it offers no insight into what people do with that information. Information processing theory, on the other hand, focuses almost exclusively on the role of internal processes in learning. In this view, people are exposed to stimuli, and whether and how they attend to, encode, store, and retrieve that information influences what they know and can do. But information processing theory has very little to say about how the social setting in which behavior occurs influences what people learn. This chapter will examine a third approach that shares common ground with operant conditioning and information processing theory, but goes beyond both. Known initially as social learning theory, and more recently as social cognitive theory, this explanation of learning was based on the premise that neither spontaneous behavior nor reinforcement was necessary for learning to occur. New behaviors could also be learned by observing and imitating a model. The current version of social cognitive theory incorporates elements of both operant conditioning and information processing, and it emphasizes how behavioral and personal factors interact with the social setting in which behavior occurs. Albert Bandura is generally considered to be the driving force behind social cognitive theory. His goal is to explain how learning results from interactions among three factors: personal characteristics, such as the various cognitive processes covered in the chapter on information processing, as well as self-perceptions and emotional states, behavioral patterns, and the social environment, such as interactions with others. Bandura calls the process of interaction among these three elements triadic reciprocal causation. This impressive-sounding mouthful is not as difficult to understand as it sounds. Triadic simply means having three elements, and reciprocal indicates that the elements influence one another. The entire term means that one's internal processes, behavior, and social environment, the triadic part of the term, can affect one another, the reciprocal part, to produce learning, the causation part. To simplify our writing and your reading, we will refer to Bandura's triadic reciprocal causation model as the triadic model. Bandura and others are particularly interested in using social cognitive theory to describe how people become self-controlled and self-regulated learners. Consequently, we will begin our exploration of social cognitive theory by taking a more detailed look at the triadic model. Then we'll explain the meaning of and differences between self-control and self-regulation. Revealing assumptions, taking learning personally. Connie leans back in her chair and looks again at the three questions she has culled from her young colleagues' journals. Don had asked, "Why don't parents prepare their children for school?" Antonio had written, "How can I get my students to study harder?" Celeste's reflection included the question, "Will the students in the class be ready for college?" Connie begins the Friday afternoon meeting by writing the questions on the board. She sits down with the others and says, "These questions from your journals are very important for us to consider today. And our first consideration is, where did they come from?" Celeste, you questioned students' readiness for college. Why? Well, it just seemed to me that the students in that class weren't learning very well. I mean, they would do the work in class and read enough to get good grades on the quizzes, but I just didn't have the sense that they were reaching their potential. Whatever was covered in class was always followed by the question, "Is this going to be on the test?" Connie nods. "Okay, thanks, Celeste. That's helpful." She turns to Antonio. "Where did your question come from, Antonio? Why do you need to make your students study harder?" Antonio says, "My students never go above and beyond either. Once they know exactly what they have to do for a grade, they just do it, and then they're done. It's like pulling teeth to get them to go beyond what's on the test, to really think. If they would just study harder, they would become better students overall." Don chimes in, "Yeah, kids don't come to school ready to learn. Maybe that's why the teacher I observed had to spend so much time getting the kids ready for the state tests." Connie says, "You seem worried that students don't take responsibility for their own learning. Is that right?" They all nod. "So how are you going to teach them to take that responsibility?" Pause and reflect. The questions from the journals of Don, Antonio, and Celeste suggest that they, like most people, recognize that effective learners take responsibility for their own learning. However, most people also believe that somehow students arrive at school having automatically acquired the ability to take that responsibility. In other words, they assume that students fail to be responsible for their own learning, not because they are unable, but because they are unwilling. Their failure is viewed as an issue of motivation rather than learning. Don, Antonio, and Celeste are concerned about student motivation, but Connie asks them to consider student learning as well. Why should teachers, regardless of the content they teach, help their students to learn how to take responsibility? How would learning to be responsible influence students' motivation and help them become better learners? How will you teach your students how to learn? The triadic reciprocal causation model. The triadic model holds that a person's behavior is always the result of interactions among personal characteristics, behavioral patterns, and environmental factors. Bandura and others describe these three elements as follows. Personal characteristics include mental and emotional factors such as goals and anxiety, metacognitive knowledge, understanding one's own cognitive processes after learning, understanding how one's own cognitive processes affect learning, and self-efficacy, beliefs about one's ability to successfully carry out particular tasks. Self-efficacy is a concept we introduced in Chapter 3 on age-level characteristics, and we will discuss it in detail in a later section of this chapter. To cite just one example of the role of personal characteristics in learning, students who have higher levels of reading ability, relevant prior knowledge, and interest learn more from text passages than do students who have low levels of these same characteristics. Behavioral patterns include self-observation, such as using personal journals to note how various factors influence learning, motivation, and self-efficacy. Self-evaluation, making changes in behavior to overcome or reduce perceptions of low efficacy, self-efficacy, anxiety, and ineffective learning strategies, and creating productive study environments. Environmental factors refer to an individual's social and physical environment. They include such things as the nature of a task, reinforcing and punishing consequences, explanations and modeling of various skills by others, and verbal persuasion from others to exhibit particular behaviors. As shown in Figure 9.1, Bandura portrays these relationships in a triangular arrangement with bidirectional arrows. Let's see where this is. The triadic reciprocal causation model, personal characteristics, environment and behavior are all affecting each other. To grasp the interactive nature of the triadic model, consider the following two examples. The components of the model are represented by the letter P for personal characteristic, B for behavioral pattern, and E for environmental factor. In each example, notice how the elements influence one another. A student's high self-efficacy for mathematical problem solving, P, leads to the student working on mathematical problems, B, rather than painting a picture. High self-efficacy also makes the student likely to persist in the face of difficulty, B. At the same time, the act of successfully working on mathematical tasks, B, raises the student's self-efficacy for solving mathematical problems, P. A teacher introduces a new science topic by describing the theory and research that contributed to the current state of knowledge in this area, B. But when students show signs of confusion or boredom, E, thereby making the teacher uncomfortable and dissatisfied, P, the teacher tries a different approach, B. Bear in mind, however, that things do not operate as simply as Figure 9.1 suggests. As the activity and setting change, the strength of certain BPE connections can be expected to change. If, for example, you happen to be in a setting such as a school in which rules and regulations place limits on behavior, the behavioral aspect of the model is likely to have less impact than if you are allowed more freedom of expression. Also, some relationships may be stronger than others at particular points in time. Social cognitive theory assumes that people and not environmental forces are the predominant cause of their own behavior. Recall that operant conditioning assumes that one's choices and actions are strongly influenced, if not determined, by environmental stimuli and consequences. Bandura uses the term personal agency to refer to the potential control we have over our own behavior, and he believes that our capacity for personal agency grows out of our skills of self-control and self-regulation. Self-control, self-regulation, and self-efficacy. Self-control, also referred to as self-discipline, is the ability to control one's actions in the absence of external reinforcement or punishment. In other words, self-control involves behaving in ways that lead to the accomplishment of desirable goals and suppressing behaviors that are detrimental when no one is looking. A student has been taught by the teacher to start a new task after finishing a seat work assignment, and who does that when the teacher is not present is exhibiting self-control. Although self-control is generally thought of as a good thing, the argument has been made that too much can stifle creativity and flexibility. Self-regulation involves the consistent and appropriate application of self-control skills to new situations. It is the product of interactions among the three components that make up Bandura's triadic model: personal characteristics, behavioral patterns, and environmental factors. Self-regulating individuals set their own performance standards, evaluate the quality of their performance, and reinforce themselves when their performance meets or exceeds their internal standards. A teacher who modifies a particular day's lesson plan to capitalize on students' interest in a major news story monitors students' reactions to the new lesson, compares her students and her own performance against an internal standard, and rewards herself if she feels that standard has been met, is illustrating the essence of self-regulation. Self-regulation is a critically important capability for students to acquire for at least three reasons. As students get older, and especially when they get into the middle and high school grades, they are expected to assume greater responsibility for their learning than was the case in earlier grades. Thus, they receive less prompting and guidance from teachers and parents. As students move through the primary, elementary, middle school, and high school grades, They have to learn and be tested over increasingly larger amounts of more complex material. With less parental and teacher supervision, the temptation to put off studying or do it superficially increases. Unfortunately, the damaging long-term consequences of poorly regulated academic behavior, low grades and diminished opportunities for higher education and employment, are not immediately apparent. Because of the rapid pace of change in today's world, individuals increasingly need to be self-directed, autonomous learners, not just during their school years, but over their lifetimes. Although the skills of self-control and self-regulation are important to academic success, some students are more successful than others in acquiring and using these skills. The characteristic that is most strongly related to and best explains differences in self-regulation is perceived self-efficacy, a concept we mentioned several times earlier in this chapter. In the next section, we further describe self-efficacy and its relationship to self-regulation. Should the development of self-regulated learning skills be left to parents and out-of-school experiences, or should this be a primary goal of our education system? If the latter, when should it begin?